Are we on? Is it working?
Can you hear us?
Thank you. My vow this term is not to fidget around with the gizmo up here and send it flying all over the place. And I'm sure the audio people will appreciate that if I manage to accomplish that. We're so glad to see you here, many old faces. No, I think this is the fourth or fifth time we've done this course. I'm not sure. And I think some of you have been with us for most of that time. So thank you for keep coming back. You make the course. How many of you are in OLLI for the first time this term? Anybody new members here? Okay. The powers that be wanted to make sure you sign, if they were here, to sign a sheet out there so that they can give them a special hello, as we would. I'm Margaret Quetus. I think I know most of you. Good to be back. I've been in Auburn since 1974 and retired from the English department about 10 years ago. Started teaching at OLLI a few years after that, beginning by going out to Valley and teaching a course on Tom Sawyer. I think I taught it here, some American poetry. And as I said, Bert and I have been doing this course for 4 or 5 times. And we continue to enjoy it. I met quickly the announcements. If you would turn off your cell phones, wear your name tags to all OLLI events, check off your names on the roster for each course, and add your name if it's not on there. And remember to clean up after yourselves. No food or drink, I believe, allowed in here, so that's probably just take your own belongings. First time, well, you all have your OLLI tags, I guess. You're not first-time members. If you're at the church, you need to sign a hold harmless agreement, which I guess means that the church is not responsible if you trip over your own feet. And the books were on sale at Sunny Slope this morning and will be tomorrow from 10 till noon for any of your classes, I guess. Wisdom Wednesday tomorrow at the museum, 2:30 to 4. David Newton, The Economic Impact of Climate Change. And advisory council nominations open next week. You may only in the form of paper and submitted only once by each member. And nomination forms and envelopes will be in each classroom location. I would add to that, if you don't have a syllabus for this course, we tried to advertise it. They're out there on the desk table. And I forgot to put our email addresses on the syllabus, but we do have a sheet out there, one sheet with our email addresses on. So if you'd like to have that, please feel free to contact us. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the nature of the course and why we selected certain books or stories and the book that we have. First of all, we would love to have this a discussion course. I've been in Julie's course, Janet Deutsch's, and there's a lot of give and take. But the size of this course and the room makes it difficult. And so if we haven't answered all of your questions, we hope maybe there'll be some time at the end for you to ask them. But it's really pretty hard. And then some people like to sit in the back, and then they can't hear, and the logistics are a problem. So after today, we have 2 stories for each course. We have them listed on the syllabus, the page numbers, and the total number of pages. I think the most pages we have are 39 for one session, but most of them are in the 20s, 30s. Shouldn't be a lot. The stories are so wonderful, you'll just want to keep reading. And on those, Bert takes one story, I take the other. And today we're going to divide the discussion, the presentation between the 2 of us. In general, we'll have 5 minutes or less at the beginning for announcements, and then 35 minutes for one of us, and then The powers that be have decreed that we need to take a 10-minute intermission. And so then we'll have the last 35 minutes. So that's the way the course will be organized. Those of you that were here last winter know that we're using the same book again. It's always a challenge to find a book that has good stories, that's affordable. And this, when we started last year, we wanted something more contemporary. In the evolution of the course, we began with some of the classic authors, Hawthorne and Poe, and we kept working up, and this was I think we're both happy with this. It's published in 2008. Some of the stories go back to 1990s, but some of them come up into the early 20th century, so it is contemporary American stories. In making our selection, and Bert, jump in here if I don't get, we tried to find stories we liked and thought you would like that show the diversity of the American short story form. It supposedly is America's contribution to literature, the short story from Poe and others. And then we usually, so diversity, interesting stories, both in what they have to say and how they say it. You know, we're interested in the art of the short story as well as subject matter. And then we try, for the most part, to pair stories that talk to each other in some way. This doesn't hold, perhaps, throughout everything here, but you'll discover that next time the common thread, for starters, is the telephone. And when we get to February 3rd, they take place in Haiti. So, you know, we have tried for that kind of thing. One thing we really worked for this time, people, and Julie, we have an Updike story. So I'm glad Julie has been disappointed that we have shortchanged John Updike in here, and he's on the syllabus for later.
Really hear what you said, except that I was supposed to do it.
No, you've always wanted a John Updike story and complained that
I didn't see it, honey.
it's on here. Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. You want to say anything more about that, Bert? The stories we chose? Or?
I guess just simply to mention, as their inclusion in this anthology indicates, these are all, I hate to use the word acclaimed, but they are well-known and nationally appreciated authors. We're not trying to discover anybody. Just because they're in this category of having gotten a lot of recognition and praise doesn't mean that you need to bow down and genuflect before them. But it may be worth knowing at least that somebody has very much admired the work of these particular writers. They're in here because of their accomplishments from a number of outside sources, which doesn't necessarily, again, need to include you. But I always find it worth knowing that somebody likes these people. And I can take issue with that, or I can get on the bandwagon. And I'm happy probably being off the bandwagon more than on it. But they're in the anthology because they have, this is just a sign of their recognition and their reputation and status.
And I think one thing both of us discovered, that sometimes there's a story that we read and thought, oh, I don't know what I would do with that. You go back and you get into it and you find there's a wealth of things to say and admire about it, and to be maybe negative too. So I hope you'll have the same experience. And I think that's my opening spiel, Bert. Did I forget anything?
I don't think so.
Okay, so now you can.
Since I've last seen you, and thanks again for being with us again, I've become a packer of hardware. I joined Margaret and John Franson and others in having metal in my body. I have a new hip joint, and whether that's going to affect my brain or not, we'll find out. I hope it will be for the better. Margaret is again indulged me, my philosophical bent. And I've talked to her into letting me talk just a little bit as usual about this enterprise more generally. She's talked about our specific, looking at short stories, reading and responding to literature. And I'll try to stay out of the deep swamp here, but I'd like to talk a little bit more generally about the creation of literature, the reading and responding to literature. We ask you on the syllabus to consider a statement by Joyce Carol Oates, which appears in the introduction to this. Margaret's going to explain that to us, and then I will get. If you've got it on your syllabus, you can read it. She recognizes some of the difficulties with what she claims here. This is on Roman numeral, page 13. All forms of art, she proposes, are generated by the wish to make of the perishable something imperishable, and of the merely finite and local something that might be called universal. A quixotic goal, perhaps, but an admirable one. So she recognizes some difficulty with that, and there are immense difficulties. She seems to be talking here about the impulse to create literature. But it occurred to me, and Margaret may disagree, that this might also refer to the consumer of this literature. Are we looking for something imperishable that's been made out of the local and the perishable? And this is where I start going into the swamp. Does art exist without someone responding to what's been created? That's pretty deep.
When he put that
Swampy water.
on an email, I didn't respond. I didn't do it.
But that Oates feels the need to come up to sort of a peroration at the end of the introduction, and she's a creative artist herself. So she's speaking, at least I think, in part out of her own experience. The desire to create something that will last out of something that's mundane and transient. We may feel the same thing as we respond to the literature. A lot of discussion about reading and responding to literature, what literature is, goes back to Horace, and as usual I'll cite him, the Roman poet. Excuse my Latin, but dulce et utile. Literature, he says, is sweet and useful. That can be translated in a good many different ways. Enjoyable and instructive, pleasant and profitable, pleasing and profitable. Literature should delight as well as instruct. That goes back to 1st century before AD. This is what literature does. Do we get some pleasure out of it? Do we find something in there that's educational? I would argue probably that we do. But deciding what's pleasurable, what's enjoyable, gets us farther into this swamp I keep talking about. Taste, individual taste do certainly differ, and taste dictates. You're going to like something, I'm not going to like something. You're going to say, well, that was pleasant and satisfying and edifying, and I would say, I went to sleep the first page and I'm glad I did. I have no desire to keep reading. I just don't like it. I just don't like it. A couple of recent essays continue to give attention to this. One of them asked the question, shouldn't literature enchant, surprise, and teach us? And it will do all of these things better, this essayist claims, if we shouldn't try to be the best reader we can possibly be. And that means not just simply responding emotionally, although literature certainly appeals to that, but trying to learn more, somewhat intellectual at least, about the literature that we're reading. The people who are creating this literature, I would say without exception, are very familiar with their predecessors as writers and what's been produced. And this is the context they're writing in. They're either following certain forms, or they're reacting to certain forms, or trying to change certain forms and create something, something new. Pleasure, then, is certainly a loaded term. It's a sticky subject. Keep my metaphor going, deep mud. It's both too restrictive and too vague. But again, something you can test for yourself. Is there some kind of pleasure you find in reading, some sort of satisfaction? The way things fit together, the way the words affect you. One person has said that there can be also sort of a negative pleasure, that sometimes we're dismayed by what we read because we're trying to fit it into a certain mold. And then we discover that really what's been done that dismays us because we don't know or understand what they're doing, we come to appreciate and see it as a major breakthrough and gives us a different kind of satisfaction. Literature, again, some people have said, should be delightful, thrilling, reflective, exhilarating, sensual, appreciative, cathartic. Can go on and on. Again, you can test to see how you respond to that. I guess part of what I'm saying is I hope that you may find your pleasure increased and your appreciation move to some different levels if you stay with it a while and continue to think about it, see how other people have reacted to it, become more aware of literary tradition and literary creation, and it may do nothing for you, or it may, as I say, increase that pleasure there. One other recent essay talked about the short story specifically, and it had very positive things to say, and I'm going to quote here, of our appreciating the short story as a brief immersion in the lives and experiences of others. That's what reading short stories does. It, though briefly, immerses us in the lives and experiences of others. And it can, this statement goes on, become a vehicle for insight. I'd submit to you that if it's going to become a vehicle for insight, we've got to spend a little more time with it and bring some contextual knowledge to it as well. Those of you who've been here before, and that includes a lot of you, know that I always try to find a metaphor for this enterprise. And the best one I've usually said I've come up with is that we're going on a guided fishing trip. There are fish out there to catch, beautiful fish, big fish, fat fish. Margaret and I are going to attempt to be your guide. We've been on the river before, but that doesn't mean that we know where the fish will be or that we can help you get them to the boat. Or if you want to take another analogy, you're on a guided tourist tour. Get on the bus and listen to the guides, or not, sleep in the back and just experience experience what you see and appreciate that without any of the context. Recently, unfortunately, probably in a nightmarish night, I've come up with another metaphor. So I'll test it on you. May want to pretend that this term you're off at summer camp. And you're going to meet some people the likes of which you've never met before from your little hometown. You're going to have camp counselors who can be talked to or with from time to time. But you're going to meet some people from your hometown, see them in some different contexts. You're going to meet some people from bigger cities. You're going to meet some people from other towns near you. And some of them you may like and some of them you may not like. But you're going to be there with them for a while. And it may be that the more time you spend with them and learn about them, the more time you want to spend with them there. So let's try that one this winter. Off to summer camp. And you can think about the stories as the people you're going to meet there, or you can think about some of the characters in the stories that you're going to get acquainted with for the first time. And you aren't obligated to go swimming with any of them. But it may turn out you do want to go swimming with them and hiking with them from time to time. Well, thanks for everybody indulging me on my metaphors. Say a little something about our first chosen author here. Tell you a few things that have been said about E.L. Doctorow at the outset, and then later, and again, certain things for you to keep in mind and to test. Well, I hadn't thought of that, but that seems right on the mark. Or, this reviewer must have been drinking or smoking something. That's not the same story I've read. Or I don't get this experience at all. Doctorow is known mainly as a writer of long fiction. He is best known and most highly regarded as a writer of longer fiction than short fiction. Published about 12 novels, 3 collections of short stories, plus a collected edition, and a number of books collecting his essays on various topics. He's best known, it said, internationally for works of historical fiction. I'd observe, and you'll hear some of the statements, that Doctorow is praised not simply in terms of his subject matter, but also on his literary form. He is, I think, both distinguished and distinctive in his subject matter as well as his technique. That's a combination worth noting, I think. E.L. Doctorow, he published, obviously, under his initials, died in 2015 at the age of 84, born in 1931. His full name is Edgar Lawrence, and I think his friends called him Edgar. Edgar Lawrence, Doctorow. His first name was given to him by his father. It was not a family name. The direct source of this Edgar is Edgar Allan Poe. And Doctorow's father was prescient, or his naming his son had supernatural consequences, because we're going to find a lot of affinities as well as some differences with Edgar Allan Poe. Anyhow, if you take the Smithsonian Magazine, I think this is the issue before the last one, but this appeared in, I think, January, February, Smithsonian, Imp of the Perverse, with the famous image of Poe here. This is the teaser. 2 centuries after his birth, Edgar Allan Poe has become our era's premier storyteller. He is the American writer. And the article says, this is the most influential American writer ever. A literary brand, of course we had to get that in, didn't we? A literary brand beyond the considerable dreams of Twain, Melville, Wharton, Whitman, Hemingway, and Fitzgerald. Nobody else is as influential as Edgar Allan Poe. And as I say, we'll have occasion with this particular story to talk about some of those affinities. But it was, Poe was a writer for whom he was named that Dr. O was very familiar, very familiar with. Dr. O's first novel appeared in 1960. His last novel, called Andrew's Mind, appeared in 2014. As I say, he's particularly well known for his historical fiction. New York Times obituary described him this way: "This author is a literary time traveler who stirred the past into fiction, situated fictional characters in recognizable historic context among identifiable historical figures, and often within unconventional narrative forms." There's the subject matter and the technique again. Probably, wouldn't you say, Dr. O's best known work is Ragtime. But he does mix fictional characters. He does make use of actual history, whatever that is. Mixes fictional characters with historical characters. He has a whole series of novels about the Depression, for example. He plays around with genre quite a bit. We'll have occasion to talk about that some today as well. But his first novel was a Western, keyed off of the Western literary genre. His second novel keyed off of the science fiction genre. But he's best known, as all these characterizations illustrate, for being a historical writer of fiction, and particularly novels. But again, as we can see, it's not limited at all just to his novel. He's also lauded, says the New York Times, for the originality, versatility, and audacity of his imagination. And I'm going to raise that question at the end when we make some assessment or some evaluation of Dr. O, what sort of praise or what sort of evaluation you're going to have for his imagination there. What else about E.L. Dr. O, who, again, as I said, enjoys a great deal of prestige. He's regarded as a major late 20th century, early 21st century writer.
I was going to say a little bit about his debunking of some American myths, his use of history. It's kind of conglomeration. As Bert said, his first novel was a Western, which he called Welcome to Hard Times. And if any of you have watched this Buster Scruggs that I think Netflix or Amazon is doing, it's kind of in that mode, you know, taking the old Western and turning it on its head. The guys in the white hats were not always that noble. And this, I started out thinking, well, it's in that mode of the West, debunking the West and the myths of the West. And it is a little bit of that, but it's really in the Midwest. It takes place in DeVille, Illinois. LaVille, nice French name for a little shabby town. I suppose it goes back to the French explorers that came up through that area. But he is, in a way, talking about the West. We're talking about people that keep moving west and the role that the West plays in the American imagination. It's always somewhere to go. So Mama and Earl have started out in Chicago, and they may even have been further east, but they've been in Chicago. And then they've ended up in LaVille, and then they're going to keep going. And I wanted to, in terms of what I think, one of the things that Dr. O is getting at is talk about, briefly, a series of stories that he published in a collection called Sweet Land Stories. Sweet Land. And it's, if you get into the stories, you know that there's just a juxtaposition of what's in the stories in the title, Sweet Land. And then in this 2015 volume that was published the year of his death, he reprints, or somebody reprints, 5 of those Sweet Land stories. In addition to House on the Plains, there's Jolene, about a, fairly uneducated, pretty girl from the Midwest who has a series of disastrous marriages, works her way west to the fringes of Hollywood. That's one of the American myths of the West. And another one, a young couple, the woman at least, kidnaps a newborn baby, and these people drift to Alaska. Okay? Then there's another one about a cult headed by William John Harmon, or somebody, a nice cultish name. But the poor schmuck of a narrator, who's a member of the cult, his wife runs off with the cultist, and I think this is also a Western setting. And then finally, it's called Baby in the Rose Garden, or Boy in the Rose Garden. In the White House Rose Garden, there's a body of a child found, a young boy. And it turns out that he was an asthmatic child from Houston who was killed by the noxious plains fumes of the oil wells. And somehow, the implication is that the oil industry, somebody, to make a point, put him in the White House Rose Garden, but then it was all covered up by all the spy agencies to protect the oil industry. But anyway, so you get this idea of these 5 stories, including ours, of the sense of the West is where people go to have a better life, or just because they drift there, and you get a lot of people we probably wouldn't want as our neighbors, or we don't have them as our neighbors, I don't know. I think what he's getting at here is it's a scrutiny, let's put it that way, on the American dream. That in a way, Mama and Earl are pursuing the American dream as one of these people that are moving west, hoping to do better. And on page 237, I love this line. Earl's talking about Bent, the handyman, just a little quick one sentence. He's realized that Earl has feelings, but that didn't make any less. The handyman Bent was not any less dangerous for all of that. It's in the middle of the page there. But the line that caught my attention. Clearly, he had never learned that the purpose of life is to improve your station in it. It was not an idea available to him. So, in their own way, Mama and Earl are set out to improve their lives, the American dream. They have this nice little big house on the plains. They've got a house. I don't know whether it's a version of Poe's house, but it's a house, although probably not what you'd expect to find on the plains. I'm not quite sure how it got there. Maybe someone with some claims to aristocracy in this little town had once built it. And they're going to keep moving, keep acquiring money. But did any of you, when we saw the title, you see the title here, A House on the Plains? Have you thought of The Little House on the Plains, the Laura Ingalls Wilder stories, Little House in the Forest, and Papa and Mama keep moving west, and of course it gets picked up and even further glamorized by the TV series. So that's one version of this westward movement, right? Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura, or whatever their names are, moving west, seeking to better themselves, be independent. And, Ma and Earl are kind of a dark underside of that version. There is, of course, a lot of history, as Bert says, involved here, just in details. The orphans are a reality. The orphan train, I think you've probably all heard of that. When did it start? Late 19th century up to the Depression, 29. There were hundreds of thousands of homeless children or orphan children in New York, for example. They just put them on a train and sent them west to help people settle the West. And these unfortunates, really unfortunates, end up with Ma and Earl. Let's see, I think the Norwegians, of course, those are the Norwegian settlement, about 1885 to, again, the Depression, and at one point, totally, there was like a third, would that be right? A third of the Norwegian population immigrated to the United States, just in search of a better life. And of course, they're another example, if you want to talk about this American dream aspect that Dr. O is calling into question, is that these people, you know, they've got an eye to the future. Here's a widow, got property, you know, assuming that, I can imagine they assume they'll marry, take charge, and have themselves a nice farm. And of course, then you've got all those townspeople who flock to the funeral. Is that the best America has to offer? Well, I don't know, but that's another version of the people of Little House on the Prairie. It's not necessarily our highest order of civilization, or maybe it is. So anyway, we're going to talk some more about the history at the end of the course, but I think in terms of the myths, in all of his novels, Ragtime's the one I'm familiar with. He takes heroes, he takes historical events, adds his own imaginative narrative to call into question our culture, our dreams, our vision. So we're going to stop there for, I think, and it's 1:25, right?
Well, close to it.
I understand that we have run out of syllabi. How many people need them? 1, 2, 3, 4. We've run out of syllabi, and we had some back there. And 4 people need syllabi? Yeah, okay. I know your email address. I can email them to you. You don't have syllabi either. Did you have anyone? I gave mine away. Did you bring one in?
Yeah, I've got it
Over there?
Yeah, I've got it here. Here, I've got it. But we can at least announce for next week.
Yeah.
Margaret, could Barbara just post it on course tutorials on the website?
Yeah, it should be on the website, yeah.
I thought Barbara said she couldn't put it
No,
on
no,
there.
we can't do the whole syllabus, but anyway.
There it is.
Can you just tell us the stories for next
Yes, that's what I'm going to do. It's Richard Bausch, B-A-U-S-C-H, 1-900. It's on page 53. And Antonia Nelson, Stitches, on page 591. Was there a next? Okay. Okay. Page 53, and then the other is 591. Antonia Nelson, Stitches.
The stories here conveniently are arranged alphabetically by the author's last name, so Bosch and Norton.
Nelson.
Nelson.
591, Stitches. We'll try to get some more.
These are our telephone stories for the term, as you'll discover. A little early, but shall we start?
Are we all here? Yeah. Okay.
Let me say just a little something reiterating what Margaret has said and cementing and adding to it a little bit, I hope. I wanted to talk about context just a little bit more, and for Dr. Rao in this story, a little bit about American literary history, and see where he fits into a look at particularly the history of the American short story. There's a difference here, obviously, between the setting of the story and the time he wrote the story. His is a contemporary short story. It appeared in New York in 2001. So it's actually published in the 21st century. But the setting is, would you agree, first couple of decades of the 20th century? We got some hints there. We know it's after the Civil War, because there's a war monument. We still got lots of horses, but some people are starting to have automobiles. So, first, second decade of the 20th century is the setting for this story. That's that historical fiction that Dr. Rao is known for. And I hope I'm not relying too much on the setting, but I wanted to point out the movement in American literary history from kind of writing that we call romantic into realism. And this dates in the late 19th century on into the 20th, and we still have realistic writing today. But realism came as a reaction to Romanticism. And this was part of an international movement. It was not just American. But the short fiction and the American short story had its beginning in the Romantic era, the first half of the 19th century in America. But it tended to emphasize emotion, the ideal. The idea in the American Transcendental Movement incorporates this completely closeness to nature, this closeness to God and spirituality. And as part of this, the American village during the Romantic era became sort of the citadel of virtue. The closer you were to nature, the closer you were to God. If you were on that farm, you were right with it. If you were in the mountains, not having to work, even better. But the closer you were to nature, and the small town was closer than the growing urban city, the more spiritual your life could be, the more spiritual your life would be. Things tended to be idealized. This is what was emphasized rather than the other. Well, there was a reaction to this, and the short story writers of the later 19th century began to capture in their fiction what's called a revolt from the village. The village ain't so perfect as these romantic writers have been making it out to be. If we look at the reality of human life in the village as well as elsewhere, it ain't going to be ideal. Let's tell it like it is. Let's quit wearing these rose-colored glasses. Let's tell it like it is. Be realistic. Be realistic. Draw real people. Dramatize real events. This is realism, and Dr. O's still fully in that tradition, obviously. Still going to be some emotion involved, but if you look at late 19th century American literature, you can see the change. There might have been some eccentric characters in the local color short stories, picturing villages here, there, and yon, but they were just eccentric. They were fun. Nothing malign about them at all. They were just eccentric. We could laugh at them. The realistic short stories about the American village were not going to be that. Not going to be that way. We were going to have a different picture of the American village than we had earlier.
Could I interject?
Yeah.
Something? In terms of the realism in your book, and if you weren't here last year, go in the West. It's not the village, but it's about the
Yeah.
West. This dirty realism or just bleak. Read the Annie Proulx story, Proulx. All I want before I die is a drink of water. A drink of water. That's,
And this had precedent in early American short stories. If you look back at the late 19th century, early 20th century, a Western writer by the name of Hamlin Garland said, look, all this stuff about the wonderful agrarian life. Have you ever worked on a farm? Have you ever tried to raise crops in the Midwest? Let's go out there today and see how we like it. Being on a farm is back-breaking and soul-crushing. That's what it is. That's what it is. That's one reason these orphans were in demand out west. They needed help to try to make a living off the land. It was far from an idyllic existence. Hamlin Garland said, let's tell it like it is. You know, it kills you. It kills you. The landlords take advantage of you. Nature is constantly working against you. Let's tell it like it really is. So this is a realistic story, and which doesn't mean that it rules out everything that we identify with Romanticism, but in its tone, its outlook, its subject matter, the way things are dealt with, it is a realistic story. I've already mentioned certain formats or forms that Dr. O likes to play around with. The American Western, we don't get the science fiction genre here. But he's going to pick up on Poe. We're going to get into this in a minute. Is this a Gothic story? Or let's basically, yes. The Haunted House, the House of Horrors, we certainly got that here. Fall of the House of Usher. Gothic is associated with dread. That's the origin of the term, the Goth invasion. We feel like we've been invaded by very malignant and alien forces. We dread. We feel a sense of dread when we read. That's part of the definition of Gothic. It became associated with the Gothic house, the haunted house. We've certainly got that here. And Poe's a romantic writer. Poe writes about ideality, and then he takes us to the Rue Morgue or Pit and the Pendulum. But not entirely separated, but Dr. O's obviously much more realistic than Poe in his stories. Very definite setting. That was one thing with the realist. Let's make it like the real life that most of us know. Let's don't set it off in the House of Usher up here. We haven't ever seen the House of Usher and all the mist and all the castles. Give us what we're really familiar with. And there are a couple of other genres, a couple of other themes that certainly have precedent and that Dr. O would know about. He did know about. One that I want to mention is the tradition of the confidence man in American literature. It's not limited to America. Goes way back, may go very far back to the trickster figure in old folk tales. Because tricks are certainly involved here. It's going to get picked up in the Western genre with the snake oil salesman. But the confidence man, people who trick other people to the benefit of the confidence man. Flim-flam man, grifter.
Ponzi schemes?
Ponzi schemes, swindlers, schemes. As I say, they're classical literature examples. They're earlier than that folklore examples. But we're going to get into the scheme to profit off of somebody. There's a good British tradition of conny catching. You get the people from the country coming into the urban area, these naive, innocent people who will buy the Brooklyn Bridge, or in this case, the London Bridge. That's a British tradition, and America is going to continue that in very fertile territory because people are over here ready to get rich, and so they're wide open to these schemes. They're very, very, very gullible. It's going to become a tradition in early 19th century American literature, and a character whose prototype and whose author lived in Lafayette, Alabama. Simon Suggs was a rascal who, the most famous story was going to a camp meeting and pretending he was converted and taking up a collection so that he could start his own church. Did Simon start his own church? He did not. Probably the most famous one of the 19th century and on comes from Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and that's the Duke and the Dolphin. They are confidence men. They're traveling the West, swindling everybody that they can swindle. Twain got that from the creator of Simon Suggs, by the way. The camp meeting comes directly from Johnson Jones Hooper. The captain attends a camp meeting. But the Duke and the Dolphin, the confidence men, and Huck engaged in a few confidence games himself, all by himself. But the swindler, the swindler, this is going to run straight through, and it's still in American literature. One that most, Michael?
I was trying to figure out, in my readings of Doctorow, what is the grading from his genre and the way he's written stories to this story? This seemed like a huge jump from what he presented, what he wrote about, and the kind of story he wrote here.
I'm not sure I understand your question.
This
Or
was not a usual Doctorow.
Okay.
As I see Doctorow, I'm trying to, what is he bringing from his nature, his writing nature, his inner being to this story? What is he trying to say?
Well, we'll get to that, maybe. Give us a little time and see if that answers your question. Writers are not going to write the same story over and over again. We're going to find some very different productions by writers, by the same writer. Very, very different. Very different. We'll see what Dr. O is doing in this story, but it is historical fiction. It is historical fiction. Well, we'll answer some of that at the end. Does it use historical figures? Well, it doesn't seem to. Yeah, I mean, we don't have Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in this story. But we'll get to that in a minute and see how typical it is of, or atypical it may be of him. But the confidence man theme is drawing out of American reality and also out of American literary tradition. One other example, this will be my final example that you're probably familiar with, is probably from the movie Paper Moon, which is actually based on a novel called Addie Pray, written by an Alabama native named Joe David Brown. But Ryan and Tatum O'Neal put that into the popular realm. But their confidence games are wonderful. They go around swindling people, poor widows who've just lost their husbands, and they sell them a Bible that their husband had ordered unbeknown to the wife. I mean, they have no scruples. They have no scruples at all. Julie?
Is there a way, is there a typical female character that's comparable to the male swimmer, like Mama?
We'll get to that too.
Is this a particular kind of character?
We'll get to that too. The men hold the stage for the most part. Who?
Jezebel?
Well, yeah. It depends on what you're, what you're trading, what you're trading, and the value returned, as Dora puts. But there are female swindlers. Tatum O'Neal played Addie Pray. She was a superb, 10-year-old swindler. She beat Big Boy at his own con game. She was better than he was. She helped his con games because nobody could resist this cute little girl. But she was good. So yes, the genders are both there. but he's operating on some literary traditions there. And realism is a clear modus operandi. As I say, this con man thing is as well. Or anything more to add there? Moving to techniques, I think what's uppermost in most people's mind, what is the major impression on them, is the narrator of A House on the Plains. It's told in first person. Earl. And I became more and more fascinated with Earl. This voice, and Dr. O talked a good bit about voice as something he was always concerned about. That's the way he wrote most of his novels. I've got to find a voice first. I've got to find a character through which I can project my voice. Voice comes first. And this is what he said specifically. There can be no story without voice. The voice and the diction that carries it precedes whatever intentions you have. In fact, he says, I don't really know where I'm going. He says some interesting things about writing. If we have time, we can talk about them. But he says a writer is like a person in a car with the headlights. I can only see as far as those headlights go when I'm actually writing. I can't see any farther with it. I'm not sure where we're going. But we're going to get somewhere if we just keep driving with the headlights. But voice is what's going to carry him there. This is his claim. There can be no story without voice. In the case of A House on the Plains, the voice came to me with the very first sentences. And he talks about the first three sentences. This, he says, is the story. Mama said I was thenceforth to be her nephew and to call her Aunt Dora. She said our fortune depended on her not having a son as old as 18 who looked more than 20. Say, Aunt Dora, she said. That's it. That's what came to him. That's the voice, and he opens himself up to that voice from this point, this point on. He also, in talking about this specifically, made a statement about the short story as a form, which we've talked about before. This is doctoral in this case. The first sentence should predict everything to come. The first sentence or the first three sentences should predict everything to come. Just like the acorn predicts the oak tree, he says. He heard these three sentences. He put them down. He had a voice, and the voice is going to carry him forward from here, according to his own testimony. The real mystery, he says, and this is about writing, although we may want to talk about the story in the same terms, the real mystery is where these three sentences came from. I'm going to have a suggestion to make about that, but the real mystery for the writer is where these three sentences came from. No mystery after that. He's just going to listen to the voices and he's going to continue to create this voice. But where did they come from in the first place? That's the mystery. That's what he doesn't understand, he said. I had a wonderful statement about writing. He said, I used to know a lot and talk a lot about writing, but now I just do it. Don't need to talk about it anymore. I just do it. But this is how he describes the creation of most of his fiction. but with this story in particular. And I was enchanted with Earl. I got more and more enchanted with Earl. This voice appears to be a major accomplishment in what you think of Earl. But I just get carried along with this voice. We may say, "What an idiot you are, Earl." But I just get carried on and on and on with this voice. I'm caught up with it. And to me, this is a major achievement. And here's that technique. And he uses it, the first person narrator, doesn't he? He uses it a good bit. But this is our example with Earl. We can look at some examples here. This is not the voice, but as many of you know, I'm fond of talking about the breaks in stories. Some short stories carry us through in a complete text. We don't have any separated sections, even a little white space or a little mark. And we've got sections here. If we had time, or you can look at it for yourself, what happens or why does this section end and another one begin? This is modulated, I think, very admirably. We don't ride on the train with them from Chicago to their new home. We stop, and then we're there. And you look at the other sections and see. Something happens, and Aunt Doris says, "Earl, we don't have as much time as I thought." No. We can make some connections there. But this is the author. This is not Earl's voice that goes on continuously. The author's obviously involved here too. This is a very small thing, and I guess I'm fond of dealing with small things. But if you did not notice, do go back and see how many times Earl says, "Of course." Of course. Of course. What does that mean? But he's obviously, this is not a narrative that's part of a dramatic action. We don't have a framework for this story. He's talking to us as readers. We know that. Dr. Rue knew that. Of course. Well, don't question what I say. You should accept this already. And the repetition of this, Aunt Dora will say it sometime too, and we know how confident she is. We know how confident she is. I think the first time he says, of course, is on page 228. He's describing the children in Chicago. They sang their own dirty words to nurture rhyme. I shooed them away, and they scattered off for a minute, hooting and hollering. And then, of course, came back again. Well, this is the way they do. This is the nature of things. This is reasonable. He seems to be accurate. But in other places, we're not in this natural territory. But he's still saying, of course. And that tends to make us say, okay, Earl, you know what you're talking about, obviously. I guess where I was first struck with it is on page 229, and again, you can go through, and there are 10, 12, maybe more occasions where he says, of course. This is about a third of the way from the bottom of page 229, and he's describing Winifred here. Cool, sweet lips, and of course, she had no titties to speak of. Of course? Now that's a different, of course, than what we got earlier there. But this is part of that voice. Of course, of course, of course, of course. But Earl is our point of view. Earl is the source of all of our information here. Am I overplaying this? This story could have been told in how many different other ways? And I think it has to do with genre in an indirect way. The question I would pose, and I'm dominating here, the question I would pose is, well, pretty clearly it's a crime story, right? It's crime. Is it a detective story? That was the genre that Poe created, was the detective story. C. Auguste Dupin was the name of his French detective, who through powers of intellectual analysis could solve murders that nobody else could solve. Certainly the bumbling police didn't have a clue, but C. Auguste Dupin could tell you who the murderer was. We don't have a detective here, do we?
Who's the detective?
We're the detective. We're the detective. And so it is a mystery story in some respects. What is Earl finding out? And again, if you go back, and I had to go back. The first time I read this story, I didn't have a clue. I was surprised as Bent was to look in that gunny sack. But there are clues and clues and clues and clues, and we're picking up on some of them. But I certainly didn't pick up on all of them. But go back and see how many clues you're given. We'd been in a number of states before we were in Illinois, he says. Well, they already moved from somewhere. And we got some clues about why they had to move from Chicago, don't we? We get more and more and more and more, and this builds up. We're told something about insurance very early. Yeah, we think much about it. Well, we begin to build up a little bit here, but more and more is revealed if we're a good detective. So it is a detective story and it is a mystery story, I would argue.
Yeah. No, all I was going to add to that was that it's kind of the way we read any kind of literature, where most of them involve mysteries, and we're the detectives.
And again, Dr. O is the creator of this. One reviewer called Earl our half-witted narrator. Seems a little dense at times, doesn't it? Lots of times. Aunt Dora says several times, or Dora or Mama says several times, use what little sense you have. You know, I'd hoped you'd be a little brighter than you are. He's not. She refers to this, but then she praises him later on. He does put some things together. What sort of assessment are we going to make of Dr. O? I have breaking news. I'm going to interrupt the program in progress and report to you from this News Network's archives. On the 28th of April, 1908, a farmhouse in LaPointe, Indiana, burned to the ground. It was a farmhouse owned by Belle Gunnis, a widow who had moved to town 7 years or so ago, had already lost one husband, and apparently she was a victim in this fire. Not the only victim. Children also died in the conflagration. But it was assumed, although it was a headless torso that was discovered in the ashes, that Belle Gunnis had perished in the fire. Well, in early May, we've got an update to our story. The sheriff of LaPorte, Indiana, had been urged to investigate a little more what appeared to be an open and shut case. Hired man on the farm by the name of Ray Lamphere had been arrested for murder and arson. He was in the county jail at that time. But a man named Asa Helgelin convinced the LaPorte sheriff that further investigation needed to take place because his brother Andrew, Asa's the one who came to town, but his brother Andrew had recently visited this town and had not been heard from since. The sheriff investigated a little bit further. They began to do some digging up of the Gunnis farm, which is already being called Murder Farm. But in the process of looking around a little bit more and digging, they discovered at least 12 more bodies. Sort of hard to get an exact count because a lot of them were body parts. But they dug body parts. But they dug up the hog pen, they looked at the well, they looked at the privy, and they discovered in total close to 15 bodies. So Dr. O is following an example of Edgar Allan Poe here and using true crime. Is he not? Dr. O said in an interview, of course. I didn't really, the main parts of my story don't correspond to the Belle Gunnis story. Ha ha. That's where you got that of course from. They do correspond. They're obvious changes. They're obvious changes. There was no Earl, for example. Earl is entirely Dr. O's creation here. Earl, there was no Earl. No child lived. We know a good bit about Belle Gunnis. She came over from Norway, changed her name, became a domestic in Chicago, lost her husband there, lost a business there to fire, lost some children there, collected insurance on all of those events, and then moved to LaPorte, Indiana, married a Mr. Gunnis there and lost him for too long. Apparently a meat grinder or a sausage grinder or a coffee grinder, different reports, fell off a shelf and hit him in the back of the head. She had a son by Mr. Gunnis, born after his death. He's one of the children who perished in the later fire. What does Dr. O do with true crime? The most famous case of Poe is called The Mystery of Marie Roget, which is based on an actual New York crime, the disappearance of a beautiful worker in a tobacco confectionery shop. Poe transferred the crime to Paris so that C. Auguste Dupin could try to solve it. But it's, Mary Cecilia Rogers was a beautiful young girl's name. She disappeared one time, came back, and then disappeared forever. Poe used this as the basis for the mystery of Marie Roget. Not the first time true crime stories have been used, but clearly Dr. O is operating on this. Whatever happened to the woman known as Belle Gunnis? There's some who believe she did go west. She went to California, changed her name, and as late as 1931, when she would have been 72 years old, experienced the death of another husband. Another husband. No. The earlier deaths, as we've got some indication here, internal ailments that couldn't be explained. Some of the people said strychnine or arsenic would explain them quite adequately. And we've got the clue here of the syringe. And this was she was going to be tried for poisoning. This woman, who by this time was named Esther Carlson. And there's still some debate about whether this was really Belle Gunness or not. But at least one of the pieces of evidence for that was that found in Esther's trunk was a picture of a woman with 3 children that most people believe was a picture of Belle Gunness with her children. Pretty distinctive, the descriptions of Belle Gunness. I've seen several of them. She was, as Earl tells us repeatedly, a large woman, somewhere between 5.5 and 6 feet tall and between 180 and 200 pounds. But apparently, she's very sexy. Very, very sexy. She had a tremendous appeal, and of course she was called the Black Widow. She had got a lot of nicknames. The Laporte Ogre. The one I like the best is Hell's Bell. Hell's Bell. Does this add or detract from what you want to think about Dr. O? He's taken the basic facts of an infamous serial killer. And there's several books about this. And Margaret and I started to bring the photographs taken of that farm. And the business about people coming to view it by the thousands is accurate.
Go to the LaPorte, Indiana County Historical Association on Amazon. And it'll. Yeah. It's got all the pictures. It's a nice little photo documentary.
Yeah. Shows them digging in the farm. It shows the people there. Sort of an exhibit. You could walk by and look at the bodies or parts of bodies that had been found. Estimations run 10,000 to 12,000 people coming into town for this. There were refreshments stands set up. Favorite food there was called Gunnish stew. All the hotels in LaPorte and surrounding areas were full. 2 railroad companies ran special trains from Indianapolis and Chicago to take the crowds there. So what I thought was gross exaggeration is factual. It is factual.
He did similar type of things with his novels.
Yeah, right.
Ragtime, Book a Day. But what made him try to do a short story? I mean, he did this as a short story, whereas he did the others, he dragged it into a big novel. Was it just the theme, just directed it for, let's keep it short, directly, and that way, or was there something else going on in his head?
We'd have to get in his head to say that. As I say, he was writing and producing short stories. He's best known as a novelist. But
I was just going to say, each genre has its own demands. I mean, challenges and rewards. And those stories that I mentioned, the focus is very narrow on one character, similar themes.
Well, there's a lot more to talk about, but no time, I think. Am I right there?
Yeah, it's time.
We're there.
So next week, Bausch and Nelson stories. And